My name is Adam Van Wert, Associate Professor of Theology at Ave Maria University. It's my privilege to introduce our speakers this afternoon. The format will be 20 minutes for each paper, 10 minutes for questions and answers, and then at the end we'll have ideally 15 minutes for a panel Q&A at the end. Joshua Lim is Assistant Professor in Theology at the University of Notre Dame. His research is in medieval Christology, focused on Thomas Aquinas. The title of his paper is Praeclarissimum Lumen Predestinationis. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lim.
The title of my talk is Praeclarissimum Lumen Predestinationis et Gratiae, Thomas Aquinas on the Predestination of Christ. In treating the doctrine of election, the great Swiss Reformed theologian of the 20th century, Karl Barth, takes special aim at Thomas Aquinas as a key figure in the Western theological tradition, who is remarkable for his failure to acknowledge the centrality of Jesus Christ in the knowledge of election. Quote, "The great exponents of the doctrine of election have not hesitated to point most emphatically to Jesus Christ when speaking of the knowledge of election. The only exception is Thomas Aquinas. He did quote Ephesians 1:4, but in his interpretation, he succeeded in not paying any attention to the in ipso, the in him," end quote. Aside from the Summa Theologiae, organized according to the Ordo Discipline, Thomas's treatment of Christ's predestination should not be taken by itself as indicating a relegation in its importance. A look at Thomas Aquinas' treatment of the predestination of Christ within 13th century medieval scholasticism tells a different story. In this paper, I will lay out Thomas's teaching on Christ's predestination against the backdrop of two parallel accounts in the 13th century with which Thomas would have been familiar, that of the Summa Hollensis and Bonaventure's commentary on the sentences. While Thomas's contemporaries undoubtedly intend to give due weight to authoritative biblical and patristic texts, the concern to safeguard the eternal character of predestination leads them to attenuate the sense in which Christ's predestination can be considered. By contrast, Thomas's account, characterized by an insistence to foreground the role of Christ's predestination in God's eternal plan, leads to a new way of considering the eternal and temporal aspects of predestination. Thomas can affirm, in no uncertain terms, that the man Christ is, in Augustine's words, the clearest light of our predestination and grace. Turning to the Summa Hollensis, I focus on chapter 5, which pertains directly to the question of its causality. The Summa Hollensis asks, quote, whether we are predestined through him. The biblical warrant for affirming the efficient and exemplar causality of Christ's predestination draws on two crucial texts. Ephesians 1:5, he predestined us to the adoption of sonship through Jesus Christ, suggests sufficient causality. Romans 8:29, those whom he foreknew he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, highlights exemplar causality. The claim to exemplar causality will consistently be tied to Augustine's later on the predestination of the saints, which refers to Christ as the clearest light of our predestination and grace. The inquiry into what it means for Christ to be the cause of our predestination gives rise to an immediate difficulty. How can one predestination be the cause of another when all are eternal and simultaneous in the divine mind? Causality implies a prior and a posterior. It seems impossible to posit causality in predestination without compromising its eternal character. The temporal and contingent nature of Christ's predestination seems to require a denial of any causal power on its part. Considering such difficulties, and motivated to affirm in some way the causality of Christ's predestination, the Summa Hollensis draws a distinction between two senses of the word. The principal signification of predestination is the divine foreknowledge with approbation, and it is eternal. The secondary is temporal and refers to effects of grace and glory. I will refer to this distinction of predestination as the Hollensian distinction. In sum, the eternal and temporal aspects of Christ's predestination are distinguished according to predestination's principle, one, and connoted significance. The result of this distinction is to preserve the divine eternity according to the principal sense, while relegating the temporal connoted effect to a secondary sense. The Summa Hollensis believes it can make sense of Scripture and Augustine without violating concerns from predestination's eternal character. The Hollensian distinction provides a resolution to the objection against the efficient causality of Christ's predestination based on the absence of priority and posteriority in what is eternal. There is absolutely no causality with respect to the eternal divine mind, that is, according to the principal sense of predestination. Nevertheless, according to its connoted temporal sense, that is, on the part of the predestined, it is possible to affirm the efficient causality of Christ's predestination. This is to say that Christ, as predestined, brings about the salvation of others who are predestined. While the distinction resolves difficulties surrounding the eternity of predestination, it leaves unclear to what reality the predestination of Christ refers. If we speak only of the connoted sense, and thus only of the temporal effects of grace and glory, we are no longer speaking of Christ's predestination according to its primary signification, but only of Christ as predestined. The problem is heightened in the Summa Hollensis' reply to an objection that denies that Christ as man is the light of our predestination. In its reply, the Summa Hollensis applies the Hollensian distinction to speak of Christ as light in two senses. Christ is understood as light according to his eternal and divine nature. According to the second sense, Christ is a temporal light, according to his human nature. The Summa Hollensis unequivocally affirms exemplarity of Christ in the first sense, as God and as eternal wisdom. The Summa Hollensis grants the premise that the ratio or light of any predestination is identical with God. Since Christ is God, it is possible to say that Christ, according to his divinity, is the eternal light of our predestination. Significantly, Augustine's text speaks explicitly of Christ as man, as the light of our predestination. To affirm Christ as light only according to his divine nature appears to go against Augustine's argument, which moves from the gratuitous character of the predestination of Christ's human nature to our own predestination. The Summa Hollensis attempts to save Augustine by recurring to the Hollensian distinctions, referring to what is connoted in predestination. The Summa Hollensis posits that Christ as man is, quote, the temporal light. The focus shifts away from Christ's predestination to consider Christ as predestined, as the temporal effect of predestination, which is the grace of adoption, is a participation in the temporal grace of Christ, by which the Son of Man is the Son of God. Christ and it can be called a temporal exemplar and light of predestination. Here, the Summa Hollensis repeats the teaching of Alexander's disputed questions before he was friar, where Alexander suggests that when St. Paul speaks in Ephesians 1:5 of our predestination to adoptive sonship per Jesum Christum, the per, which denotes efficient causality, should be understood not as referring to eternal predestination, but only to our adoption in time. Notwithstanding the Summa Hollensis' clear desire to affirm the causality of Christ's predestination, the explanation of its causal role via the Hollensian distinction leads to its minimization. According to predestination's principal sense, the Summa Hollensis is clear. The predestination of Christ is not the light of our predestination. And then turning to Bonaventure. Bonaventure's development of the Summa Hollensis account in his commentary on Lombard sentences, Book 3, Distinction 10, applies the Hollensian distinction to the predestination of Christ, further diminishing its significance. Bonaventure's reduction of the exemplar causality of Christ's predestination to its connoted temporal sense leads to a moral interpretation of Augustine's text opposed to Augustine's intention. Augustine's purpose in pointing to the exemplarity of Christ's predestination is to emphasize the gratuity of God's grace. It is precisely because no merit or human act can be conceived as preceding the human nature's union to the Word that Christ's predestination is the exemplar of our predestination. For Bonaventure, the doctrine of the exemplarity of Christ's predestination becomes the occasion to consider what we must do in order to be conformed to Christ. Here, the Hollensian distinction not only limits Bonaventure's consideration of Christ's predestination as a temporal exemplar, but becomes the basis for a doctrine of moral exemplarity. In considering exemplarity, Bonaventure follows the Summa Hollensis in affirming that predestination is nothing other than divine essence. As a result, there can be no relation of exemplarity between individual predestinations, for all predestinations are one. The exemplarity of Christ's predestination as man is affirmed only with respect to the effect of his predestination, namely his grace and glory in time. Bonaventure makes an application of the Hollensian distinction, seeing Christ's exemplarity as belonging to predestination's connoted sense. The result is an emphasis on Christ's moral exemplarity. For the grace of God is rightly in us when we are conformed to Christ. If we wish to arrive at the final term of predestination, we must look to the author and perfecter of faith, who gave an example for how we should act. For as Peter says, Christ suffered for us, leaving us an example. Bonaventure's focus on the connoted temporary sense of Christ's predestination leads to an interpretation of Augustine's text that is antithetical to its original intention. Augustine says that Christ is the clearest light of our predestination, as if God says to each of us, "Look and act according to the exemplar revealed to you in the mountain, that is, to Christ." End quote. Like Summa Hollensis before him, Bonaventure is aware that he must affirm the exemplarity of Christ's predestination, as well as its efficient causality, but the Hollensian distinction, alongside his own curtailed view of Christ's human nature, prevents him from a robust account. On account of his use of the Hollensian distinction, Bonaventure is forced to reduce the question of the causality of Christ's predestination to its extrinsic temporal effect. As a result, Bonaventure's stated affirmation of the exemplarity of Christ's predestination turns into an affirmation of the exemplarity, not of Christ's predestination as such, but of his human acts in time. Christ's predestination thus becomes the occasion for moral exhortation. Okay, so turning to the Summa Theologiae. In broad strokes, Thomas's intention in the tertia pars is not different from that of his contemporaries. Thomas wishes to preserve the eternal character of predestination while finding some way to account for the causality of Christ's predestination. Like his contemporaries, Thomas resolves the concern not to violate the principle that the eternal has no cause through a distinction between predestination's eternal and temporal aspects. Instead of following the Hollensian distinction between predestination's primary and secondary sense, Thomas distinguishes the eternal act of predestination from its temporal term. For the sake of simplicity, I will refer to Thomas's distinction as the Thomasian distinction, and summarize it goes, the eternal and temporal acts of Christ's predestination are distinguished according to the act and to the term of predestination. The result of this distinction is to preserve the divine eternity without relegating the temporal aspect to something secondary. The temporal effect as terminus ad quem specifies the eternal act. Turning to Thomas's treatment of Christ's predestination, we see how the Thomasian distinction enables a more robust account of its causality. Thomas identifies two aspects of Christ's predestination, the act of the one who and the term and effect of predestination. According to the act, Christ's predestination cannot be the exemplar of our own, for in one mode and in the same eternal act God predestined us and Christ. Here, Thomas joins the rest of his contemporaries in denying the causality of Christ's predestination with respect to its properly eternal aspect. For Thomas, the temporal aspect does not refer to a connoted and secondary sense of predestination, but to the term of the act, that to which one is predestined. Though absent in Thomas's scriptum, Augustine's on the predestination of the saints figures largely in Thomas's reconsideration in the Summa of Christ's predestination. In the Sed Contra, Thomas quotes a fuller version of the text, which makes clear that exemplarity is predicated of Christ precisely as man. Quote, he is the clearest light of predestination and grace, our Savior, the mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ. End quote. Further, Thomas clarifies that Christ's exemplarity is here considered not simply in terms of the temporal effect of grace, but in terms of his predestination. He is called the light of predestination and grace, inasmuch through his predestination and grace, our predestination is made clear. This pertains to the ratio of an exemplar. In his emphasis on Christ's human nature and on the exemplarity of Christ's predestination, Thomas moves away from the Summa Hollensis, which emphasized Christ's divine nature as exemplar, and from Bonaventure, who posited a moral reading of it, returning to Augustine's original intention. Christ's predestination is exemplary in two ways. First, since predestination is ordered to a good, in fact, to the highest good, which is the final end, the predestination of Christ to natural sonship serves as an exemplar for our own predestination to adoptive sonship. Thomas relies on the work he has done in question 23 on filial adoption to show the predestined are ordered to a participation in the natural sonship of Christ as their final end. The teleological orientation of predestination, explicit in the early definition of the prima pars, is reintroduced under the concrete end of the predestined to be adopted children of God. For he is predestined to be the natural Son of God, but we are predestined to the sonship of adoption, a kind of participated likeness of the natural sonship. Thomas relies on Romans 8:29, whom he foreknew, these also he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Notable by its absence is any distinction between Christ's temporal and eternal exemplarity. Through the Thomasian distinction, Thomas overcomes the difficulty faced by the Summa Hollensis. It is precisely as man that he is considered the light of our predestination. Thomas does not stop here. Christ's predestination is exemplary with respect to the good to which it is ordered, but also with respect to, quote, the way of obtaining that good, which is through grace. In direct contrast to Bonaventure's teaching on exemplarity as primarily moral, whereby the predestination of Christ is meant to show us how we ought to conduct our lives, Thomas recovers Augustine's original intention, focusing on the prerogative manifest in Christ because the human nature in him, by no preceding merits on its part, was united to the Son of God. The predestination of Christ is not a moral exemplar, but an exemplar of divine grace. For the Summa Hulensis, and in a mitigated way for Bonaventure, the affirmation of the causality of Christ practically amounted to a consideration of the effect of Christ's predestination in time, that is, the role of Christ's temporal life with respect to our own. These thinkers required the bracketing of the eternal. They considered the causality of Christ as predestined. By contrast, the focus in the Tertia remains on Christ's predestination as such, the role of Christ's life from God's eternal preordination. Thomas focuses on the means and order of our salvation under divine predestination. Thomas signals the unity of act and term by constantly highlighting their relation. Quote, "For in this way God foreordained our salvation by predestining from eternity that it should be completed through Jesus Christ." Thomas offers an interpretation of Ephesians 1:5, who predestined the adoption of sonship, distinct from Alexander, who took Paul's per Iesum Christum to refer to temporal adoption rather than predestination. Thomas reads the through as referring to our predestination, and speaking of the temporal term of predestination, Thomas is not forced to move away from the eternal act of predestination to consider something extrinsic to it. We are adopted through Jesus Christ because we are predestined through him. The developments in Thomas's teaching on Christ's predestination, seen most closely against the backdrop of the broader discussion in 13th century scholasticism, offer a correction to Barth's harsh appraisal. Through the Thomasian distinction, Thomas is able to affirm not only that the predestined Christ in time brings about our salvation, but that from eternity, Jesus Christ is at the heart of God's plan of salvation. Thank you.
Questions? Please use the microphone for the people on Zoom.
Am I allowed? Joshua, do you think there's any connection? Does the Summa take a position on the possibility of the eternity of the world? And two, do you think there might be any connection between, say, the difference between Bonaventure and Thomas on the eternity of the world's creation and this question of the eternal predestination of Christ? Thomas seems to have a way to think causality without temporal priority, right? And I'm wondering if there might be some relation between those.
I don't know what the Summa Hollensis says about that. As far as the eternity of the world, I haven't thought about that. I will have to think about that. I've been trying to think of areas outside of this consideration where Aquinas might come up with this sort of distinction. I think it's latent in the Prima Pars account, but it seems like it's brought out explicitly. It deals with the predestination of Christ. I would have to think about it in relation to the eternity of the world. Thanks.
Other question?
Hey, those are great paper. The question I had was similar. Why wouldn't Karl Barth be satisfied with that, since you didn't choose to use that as a hook? It all just seems quite reasonable. I wondered if there was something else in Barth, and that you might, just going back to that hook after you presented, would seem very reasonable. I wonder what you would think, or if you had a thought on that.
Barth would not be satisfied because he wants to say the subject of predestination or electing is Jesus Christ. With respect to what Bonaventure, the Summa Hollensis, and Thomas Aquinas, distinguishing the eternal aspect and denying causality there, that would preclude Barth's position, because it seems like Barth wants to say that somehow God's decision to be for us in Christ precedes election, or I'm not entirely sure if he would say precedes election, but in some ways constitutive the decision to elect. All three thinkers would preclude position simply because they don't allow for causality with respect to what is eternal.
Thank you for your paper. I was wondering, Bonaventure, when he talks about to what extent Christ's humanity can cause grace, he thinks about it more in terms of moral causality, whereas later Thomas will think about it in terms of instrumental efficient causality. Thomas doesn't think Christ is an instrumental efficient cause in predestination, if I understand correctly. But do you think that there's any connection between this and Thomas's developments on Christ?
There is, yeah. So what initially got me interested in the paper was I thought Thomas disagreed with others in affirming efficient cause with respect to Christ's predestination. Then the way he hashed it out, I thought maybe they were all saying the same thing. One difference is for Bonaventure, Christ's human nature can only be a dispositive or excitative cause, not efficiently cause grace. In the fuller version of this, I treat the question of efficient causality. There you have two reasons why Aquinas represents a deepening in how we understand the causality of Christ with respect to his predestination as such, but also with respect to his human nature, he is the efficient cause.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for the paper. Just a question of ignorance. On Romans 8:29, you said it was exemplary, reference to exemplary causality.
Yep.
why is exemplary causality a problematic cause according to the problem you lay out?
Who is it an exemplar for? If you say it's for God, then you're introducing priority and posteriority in eternity. Likewise, if you say for us, I think either respect, it would be problematic. But the move that Bonaventure makes is to say that nothing temporal can be an exemplar for God. Anytime we talk about exemplarity with respect to what is temporal, it has to be for us. The way Bonaventure goes with that is, therefore, it has to be moral exemplarity. I think his reason why it can't be eternal is sound. It's not as if God regards something temporal as an exemplar for what he's going to do in time. Doesn't make sense.
Our second speaker, Frederick Bauerschmidt, professor of theology at Loyola University, Maryland, and a deacon of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. He is the author of several books, including Thinking Through Aquinas from Word on Fire Academic. The paper he has this afternoon is titled The Question of Infused Habits, Christ's Knowledge and Our Virtue. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bausch.
Thank you, Adam. Two wrongs almost certainly don't make a right, but my gamble is that two sources of puzzlement brought together might shed some illumination. The puzzlement is over this notion of infused habits, which occurred in two places in Thomas. It occurs in the Secunda Pars, talking about the infused moral virtues, and the Tertia Pars in connection with the knowledge of Christ. Christ has infused habits of knowledge. And I think most people in these areas agree that notions of infused habits are puzzling. They bring with them all sorts of issues and controversies. The first part of the paper, I try and lay out what some of those issues are, but let me just do a real short summary, and I'm just going to trust on y'all's vast reservoir of knowledge. I hope I'm not going to leave anybody behind. With regard to the infused habit, this is a question that has revived as a controversy in the last decade. I witnessed its revival at a conference in Utrecht about a decade ago that had Bill Madison, Angelic Noble, David DeCosimo, Tom Osborne, and they were going at it hammer and claw. I didn't know this was something you could be interested in. A lot's happened in the last decade. The basic claim of Thomas is that along with faith, hope, and love, the infused theological virtues, there are also infused moral virtues that correspond by name with the acquired moral virtues. And it seems to me that there's three options for interpreting these infused moral virtues in the case of a Christian in the state of grace, and the relationship of these infused virtues to acquired virtues that a person might have had before entering into a state of grace. What I would call the traditional view is that a Christian in a state of grace can simultaneously possess both acquired moral virtue and infused moral virtue, and that there's a division of labor, right? Yeah, the acquired virtues help you with your natural end, the infused virtues help you with your supernatural end. There's what I would call the revisionist version, which used to be a distinct minority, but I think is rapidly becoming a majority, which is that for the Christian in the state of grace, there's only infused virtue. Acquired virtues are either replaced or transformed with the infusion of supernatural charity. And then third, there's what I would call the revisionist or neo-traditional approach, which posits simultaneous possession of infused and acquired moral virtues and ordering of the acquired virtues by the infused virtue. The interpretive question is, when you read the Secunda Pars, particularly the Secunda Secundae, are you reading about infused virtues or acquired virtues? Thomas never says. And some things he says could only be true of infused virtues. Some things would be true of acquired virtues. And the real question is, why does Thomas never tell us? That's the question about infused moral virtue. The puzzle over Christ's infused knowledge is Aquinas' position laid out in the Tertia Pars. In addition to his knowledge as the Word, Christ's human soul possesses three sorts of knowledge, right? I'm familiar with this. Beatific knowledge, controversial among modern theologians, modern Christologies, Jesus as miserable and ignorant as us. Christ also has acquired knowledge. Thomas is somewhat swimming against the medieval tide in the robust of what he wants to, of his account of Christ acquired knowledge. And then third, infused knowledge, which most modern theologians don't pay enough attention to disagree with Thomas on this. This is generally compared with the kind of knowledge that angels have, which raises a couple of puzzles. One is the puzzle about baby Jesus, using Father Gaine's examples. Baby Jesus, knowing from conception Chinese grammar, details of quantum physics, or how to fly a jumbo jet. So that's one puzzle with this infused knowledge. The second is the idea that the passive intellect can possess identical forms from two different sources. Seems strange. The parallels between these puzzles, I hope, are obvious. As regards the overall scheme, in both cases, we're dealing with the infusion of a set of habits. These infused habits fall midway in a threefold scheme, right? The infused moral virtues are midway between the infused theological virtues and the acquired moral virtues. The infused knowledge of Christ is midway between his beatific knowledge and his knowledge from sense experience. In both cases, the upper member of the triad, the theological virtues and the beatific vision, is or intuitive pieces of knowledge or specific actions. In both cases, there is no obvious problem relating the infused habit of the higher two lower members. The puzzle is how the infused habit relates to the acquired habit. Jean Porter says the infused virtues represent the comprehensive perfection of the faculties they inform. They are not compatible with the acquired virtues, another kind of comprehensive perfection of the same faculties. What she says about infused moral virtue, you could say about the infused knowledge of Christ. What seems clear in one domain seems unclear in the others. In the case of Christ's knowledge, it seems the case. Thomas maintains that Christ possesses infused and acquired habits simultaneously within the same faculty. Thomas clearly says Christ has both forms of knowledge. Should this tilt the debate over infused and acquired virtue toward the position that the same person can possess both kinds of virtue? Thomas holds to the coexistence of these two sorts of knowledge in Christ. It still raises a host of difficult questions. So maybe it doesn't help us. Maybe it should tilt us away from the notion that we can have infused and acquired moral virtues simultaneously. Thomas argues for the infused virtues on the basis of imperfection, leaving aside existential or psychological questions. Christ has to have infused virtue because he has to have the most perfect form of human knowledge. He must have all faculties perfected. Christians need to have infused moral virtues for it to be perfected in the things of this world so that they can attain beatitude, right? It's argued for moral perfection. Thomas never seems to ask what it might feel like to have infused habits, whether of virtue or knowledge, nor how you might narrate this in terms of a life story, whether of the Christian or of Christ. Given all these puzzles, from what Thomas says and from what he does not say, there's all sorts of questions he just doesn't answer that seem obvious to us. Can we undo this tangle by comparing what he has to say in these two domains? Thomas is relatively clear that infused and acquired moral virtue are distinct habits. They differ not only in relation to the ultimate end, but also in relation to their proper objects. The acquired virtues have to do with life in the earthly city, and infused virtues have to do with our heavenly citizenship. While wayfarers, we remain in some sense residents of the earthly city, even while through grace we are citizens of the heavenly. Such simultaneous possession of infused and acquired virtue then would seem not only to accord with our actual experience of having mundane concerns, even while we're yearning for beatitude, it also tracks with Thomas's position that Christ possesses acquired and infused habits of knowledge. If the Christian in a state of grace does simultaneously possess both acquired and infused moral virtues, it seems to me that the integrity of the human person suggests that these different sorts of habit must in some way be integrated. I find convincing the account of relationship of the acquired and infused moral virtue to be the one I described as the sort of neo-traditionalist or re-revisionist approach, which is that the acquired and infused moral virtues can both be in a Christian in a state of grace, with acquired virtues ordered to the final end via the infused moral virtues. So I'm going to go with the people who want to say the Christian in a state of grace has both kinds of virtue, with the infused virtues ordering the acquired virtues to beatitude. For example, the prudence that the abbot exercises with regard to negotiating fair prices with vendors can be ordered to the end of by being subordinated to the infused prudence by which he cares for the souls of his monks, which in turn actually enhances his care of earthly matters. If acquired virtues are ordered to their end by infused virtues, does it make sense to suggest the acquired and infused knowledge of Christ is similarly integrated? Can a higher mode of knowledge order a lower mode? On the one hand, this would seem to somewhat restrict the contents of Christ's infused knowledge. And this is one of the things Thomas says. It says that Christ has his infused knowledge is comprehensive. Everything that can be known by a human being is known by Christ from the moment of his conception. My proposal that the higher knowledge is ordering the lower knowledge might seem to somewhat restrict that content. While he might have infused knowledge of carpentry, it would be precisely that knowledge relevant to his mission of advancing humanity in goodness and removing it from evil. On the other hand, if we were willing to restrict Christ's infused knowledge, it would certainly relieve us of the burden of imagining infant Jesus knowing Chinese grammar, the details of quantum physics, or how to fly a jumbo jet, while still allowing that Christ has specific knowledge relevant to his saving mission that exceeds natural human knowledge. Thomas says Christ had infused knowledge of the marital situation of the Samaritan woman to bring her to a spiritual understanding. We can retain Christ's infused knowledge, distinct from his acquired knowledge, ordered to his saving mission to bring humanity to its ultimate end. If the ordering of acquired virtue to the final end is mediated by infused moral virtue, then perhaps it's through the mediation of Christ's infused knowledge that his acquired knowledge is ordered to his mission of bringing human beings to beatitude by the light of divine glory. Christ possesses the fullness of infused knowledge is that he possesses by special divine gift the capacity to use anything that a human being can know for the honor and glory of God. Perhaps the knowledge of carpentry is not simply the acquired knowledge of carpentry, and that there is a knowledge of carpentry by which Christ knows that his human life and labor is part of his salvific mission. The infused knowledge of Christ then would serve to mediate between his beatific knowledge and his acquired knowledge by referring that acquired knowledge to the end that is beheld in the light of glory. Conclude with some reflections. Does this solve the problem? I don't know. I'm not sure. I've been thinking about this since that conference in Utrecht 10 years ago, and I still don't know. What's puzzling about these areas is that the questions seem so obvious to us, yet Thomas doesn't seem to address the questions which seem to us so obvious. I always tell my students, Thomas is not only good at giving answers, he's great at asking questions. He thinks up new questions all the time. How do we think about the things Thomas doesn't ask about, the distinctions he doesn't draw, the things he leaves unclarified? The tendency to treat Thomas as having an answer for everything is a persisting sin among lovers of St. Thomas, engendered not simply because of the Church's tendency to treat him as a kind of oracle. He answers so many questions so well. Because he's so clear about important things, one temptation in the face of Thomas's silence, especially around our modern questions about the experience of persons, is to decide that there's something wrong with those questions, that these are not questions worth asking. But that is mistaken. I can't imagine anything less in the spirit of St. Thomas. Another temptation is to think that because Thomas doesn't address these questions, he has nothing to teach us even by his silence. Thomas's silences might be the result of his failure to imagine a question we might have, perhaps as a result of the limits of his historical horizon. In some cases, these silences might be more deliberate, a certain kind of reticence that recognizes the limits of our inquiry. Thomas's dry and precise scholastic idiom can tempt us to treat his distinctions as a total inventory out of which human thinking about God and all other things in relation to God can be constructed. But Joseph Pieper is only slightly overstating his case when he says its fragmentary character belongs to the total implication of the Summa Theologiae. Perhaps a summary of theology, by its very nature, must be incomplete, and not only in the sense of the whole being unfinished, distinctions that might have been made being left unmade, conclusions that might have been drawn being left undrawn. When Thomas does not pursue a question, does not make a distinction, does not draw a conclusion, this may be a simple failure on his part. It might be a significant silence, telling us something important about theological inquiry and the inquiring subject. We must keep in mind what Thomas knew, that distinctions between various sorts of habits and our best attempts to explain their relation are simply heuristic devices that represent our best attempts to account for, on the one hand, the moral and spiritual development of human beings and the claims about Christ in Scripture and tradition. Distinctions to account for human action or the knowledge of Christ should be made while bearing in mind that what we are attempting to grasp are living wholes, And such wholes always suffer somewhat from the autopsies that we theologians perform on them. Though he was the master of the distinction, I do not believe that Thomas ever forgot this and that we would forget it at our peril. Thank you.
I'm Adam Idle. I teach at the University of Dallas. I wanted to just say one thing about the analogy you're constructing. And this, I'll admit, is a shameless plug for my own paper for those of you who will be here tomorrow. One of the issues with the debate over the acquired and infused has to do with just the completely ahistorical vacuum in which it's been carried out. Once you read Thomas in his context, the generation prior to him, and William of in particular, held that the acquired and infused virtues cannot be compatible. Albert and Bonaventure say, no, they exist together. Objectors say you can't have two forms of the same species in the same subject. And that's what prompts Thomas to say they differ in species then. So to see that progression is important because the reason he's arguing for the distinction in species is that allows him to say they exist together. It's difficult to hitch the problem to a problem that's so problematic, but if we put all that in place, I think you're on the right track. I wanted to ask about the ordering of the two kinds of knowledge. Thomas, in the Tertia Pars, comes to that view after having rejected it in the Scriptum. It's actually he actually comes to say later, they have to be together. How does he think of things being ordered? This has to do with wisdom. In the same way that the acquired virtues are ordered by charity, would it not be the case that Christ's wisdom orders both kinds of knowledge?
It seems to me that even if charity is ordering both the infused and acquired moral virtues, I think it's in De Virtutibus 110, where he talks about how the infused moral virtues also have a role in ordering the acquired virtues, right? Yeah, and I know it's a controversial passage, but that suggests to me that even if wisdom or beatific knowledge is ordering the acquired virtues, it maybe you can think of it as ordering it by means of the acquired knowledge. Maybe it's doing it by means of the infused knowledge. I tried in the longer version of the paper come up with examples of how this could help us read the stories in the Gospels. I know Drew's going to disagree with me because we had a conversation earlier.
Thanks for your thought-provoking paper. You made a case for the continued utility of the acquired moral virtues in the life of a Christian. You gave that example of the abbot negotiating bread prices for his monastery could use his prudence and justice.
French monastery.
They probably make their own wine. Okay, selling it in any case. I guess the question I have is, in the case of a Christian who has the infused moral virtues but lacks the acquired virtues, is such a person just going to be unable to really negotiate their earthly life very well, or will the infused virtues allow them to take care of their day-to-day business in light of their pursuit of heaven in a way that would be sufficient, or are they really going to be lacking something to make them function well as a human being on the wine negotiation prices?
I think The Holy Fool is more than just a literary convention from Russian literature. I feel like I know a few people who don't navigate life are characterized by worldly excellence, yet, in my mind, undeniably holy. Maybe that would be what it would look like for somebody to have the infused virtues, but not the acquired virtues. The infused virtues keep you ordered to beatitude, presumably out of mortal sin, but it might not make you wise in the ways of the world. It might be a more difficult path. That would be the example I think of.
Lots of Christians might not have the acquired moral virtues. They might not be holy fools. So what about a person?
Holy by habit, if not by act. It might be the case that a lot of people behave in foolish ways while still being in a state of grace. It's hard to say. There's places in Thomas where he seems to imply that the infused virtues can sometimes compensate.
Thank you. I'd love for you to go back to the Gospels. And in particular, I'm thinking about the times when there's a question of whether Jesus knew of the answer to a question he was asking. The typical patristic response, which Aquinas draws on, is he knew, but he did that for our sake. And I'm wondering if, speak about the Gospels in whatever way you want, but in particular, if there's any way we could make sense of that interpretation in light
A
of.
classic example of Jesus not knowing something is Mark 13. No one knows, only the Father, not the Son. And my proposal could work that in some ways he has a infused knowledge of this. That's a kind of one thing I left out was the distinction in terms of the infused virtues between having the habit and being able to exercise the act. I was saying this might help us think about the infused knowledge of Christ. He could have it, in a sense, habitually, but not be able to activate it. And in the case of the Son, in his humanity, not knowing the hour, maybe that's important for the work of salvation, right? I think it could also give you, of course, Thomas would not like this, but it could even give you a way to rethink what Paul means by fides Christi, right? Thomas says Christ doesn't have faith. Perhaps there is a kind of a habitual infused knowledge. But the other case I thought of was the case of the Canaanite woman. Modern people don't like the standard patristic exegesis, which is, Thomas cites Origen, Jerome, Augustine, who all say, oh, yeah, no, he knew about her faith. She's not teaching him anything. It could be that out of that encounter, Christ gains a certain kind of acquired knowledge that activates his habitual knowledge about his mission. He has habitual knowledge. He's come not just for Jew, but for Gentile. But that habitual knowledge needs to be exercised to become active knowledge. The acquisition of knowledge in that empirical encounter with the Canaanite woman might be an occasion. I don't think Thomas would like that interpretation, but I can draw some principles from him to make that more supported. In a sense, you would say, in terms of his infused knowledge, he knew his mission was to both Jew and Gentile. There is an acquired knowledge. Thomas wouldn't like me saying she taught him anything, because Christ doesn't learn it from another human being. He just learns it from watching. That would be another example. Thank you.
Father Simon Francis Gaine is a member of the English Dominicans. Before joining the order, he studied theology at Oxford, subsequently teaching there and serving as regent of Blackfriars Hall. He currently teaches at the Angelicum in Rome and is both director of the Angelicum Thomistic Institute. He's a member of the International Theological Commission and the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, and the author of Will There Be Free Will in Heaven? And Did the Savior See the Father? The title of his paper this afternoon is Aquinas on Christ's Co-Assumption of Power. Please join me in welcoming Father Gaine.
When the third part of Aquinas' Summa Theologiae has concluded its treatment of the human nature assumed in the Incarnation, the author moves on to what is co-assumed in the union, before treating the union's consequences. He speaks of three perfections co-assumed in the union: Christ's grace, knowledge, and power. Both Christ's grace and knowledge have been much discussed in recent work on Aquinas, but little has been said about Christ's co-assumption of power in his human soul. Even treatments of Christ's miracles can neglect his co-assumption of the power to work them. The medieval discussion of Christ's human power focused on whether Christ's human soul was omnipotent. Given that he knew everything in his human soul, did he also have the power to do everything? Early modern scholasticism debated how to categorize the power found in Christ's human soul. My focus is on why Aquinas speaks of the power to work miracles as co-assumed rather than a consequence of the union. Aquinas had treated Christ's power under a broader category of consequences of the union. In the Summa, the union, this is a category of dividing material that he took from the Summa Theologica of Ander of Hales and his Franciscan disciples. Alexander treated penalties Christ took on for our salvation. These he took not as pertaining necessarily to human nature, but as defects freely co-assumed. Aquinas expanded the division of co-assumed by including not only defects like bodily passibility, but also perfections, namely grace, knowledge, and power. He now shifted to what was freely co-assumed. Not that Aquinas' treatment of perfections co-assumed only spoke of what was co-assumed, strictly speaking. He also touched on some things inevitably assumed in human nature, and on what was freely not co-assumed, and what was not co-assumable. For example, when treating Christ's knowledge, he makes it clear Christ did not co-assume full comprehension of the divine nature, because the infinite act of knowledge would entail is simply not possible for a finite intellect. At the same time, this helped Aquinas distinguish one thing Christ did co-assume: the blessed vision of the divine essence, and in it, vision of everything God creates. He distinguishes that from uncomprehension of the divine essence and knowledge of the infinity of worlds God can possibly create. Aquinas considers Christ's co-assumption of power. Christ does not have omnipotence, the active power to do anything in his human soul. Since the distinction of Christ's natures is maintained in the union, and the power to do anything belongs to the infinite divine nature, Christ's human nature does not possess strict omnipotence, but the active power belonging to human nature. So Christ's human nature is not involved in creation out of nothing, which Aquinas takes to pertain only to the infinite power of the divine nature. It is the same with anything on the same level as creation out of nothing. Aquinas thus concludes that Christ's human soul did not have the power of annihilation. The power of annihilation, like that of the preservation of creatures, belongs to divine power alone. What is freely co-assumed is distinguished not only from what is strictly unco-assumable, but also from what is inevitably assumed in the human nature. This figures in Aquinas' consideration of Christ's knowledge, which is mainly concerned with Christ's co-assumption of blessed, infused, and acquired knowledge. He mentions that Christ, having a human intellect, had knowledge of first principles. For Aquinas, such knowledge comes inevitably by having a human mind, not freely assumed. What is inevitably assumed with human nature plays a greater role when Aquinas comes to Christ's power. He needs to distinguish what is strictly assumed from what is assumed. In the union, Christ assumes the natural powers of the human soul to rule the body and be the source of normal human acts that pertain to human nature. Hence, Christ's soul had the same power with regard to the body that every human soul does, and such things come by nature. Aquinas does not say that any power relating to the supernatural is co-assumed. While the distinction between natural and supernatural plays a role here, it is not the crucial distinction. Before he goes on to speak of the co-assumption of the power to work miracles, Aquinas also speaks of Christ's ability to act in a way that is not miraculous, but nevertheless supernatural. He is concerned here with acts that follow from Christ's co-assumption not of power, but of his fullness of grace and knowledge. This supernatural grace and knowledge enable Christ to naturally enlighten rational creatures. This is not considered a miracle because the supernatural enlightenment of angels and human beings does not mean a departure from the regular order and course of things. Grace and knowledge enable Christ to enlighten others as the efficient cause of their illumination, just as the assumption of human nature enables Christ to act as a proper human agent, allows him to be the cause, in his humanity, of certain supernatural acts, like enlightening others. With the working of miracles, Aquinas does not consider Christ to have been acting humanly as a principal efficient cause. There can be no principal cause of what departs from the whole order and course of the created order except God. Aquinas has already set out his position in the first part of the Summa that miracles are attributed only to divine power. Where God causes something not effected by created causes, what creatures can do by their natural power remains within the order of things. God alone can be the principal cause of effects that depart from that order. Aquinas identifies the power in Christ's soul to work miracles, not as one where he acts humanly as a principal efficient cause, but one where he works humanly as an instrumental cause. It's the distinction between principal and instrumental efficient cause that enables Aquinas to home in on Christ's specific co-assumption of power. He has prepared the way for this by first considering Christ's power arising from his human nature, adding the power from his co-assumption of grace and knowledge, before finally coming to the power co-assumed precisely where his human soul operates instrumentally to cause miracles. We've seen that creation out of nothing and annihilation are simply unco-assumable, and there Christ's human instrumentality could have nothing to contribute. My question is whether Christ assumed the power to perform every miracle co-assumable, where his instrumentality would contribute. For every possible miracle, did Christ assume the power to work that miracle? Should it have been the case that the power to work every possible miracle was an inevitable consequence of the union, any incarnate divine person would have the power to work every possible miracle. We would have to say the same of Christ. He necessarily had the power to work every possible miracle. But what if the power to work miracles is, as Aquinas treats it in the Summa, something freely assumed? Does he assume the power to work every possible miracle? In the course of discussing the question of Christ's omnipotence in regard to his own body, Aquinas intimates a possible miracle that Christ did not assume the power to perform. He puts the following objection to Christ not having over his body. Through the state of original justice, Adam's body was entirely subject to the soul, such that nothing could happen to the body against the will of the soul. Now, given that Christ was more perfect than Adam, the objection goes, his soul should have had omnipotence over his body. In his reply, Aquinas is clear that, while Adam did not have anything like omnipotence over his body, he did have the power to preserve it from injury. Christ could have taken on this power if he wanted to. Perhaps the simplest way to interpret this is to suppose that Aquinas was merely excluding from Christ the version of imity proper to original justice, because he'd already said by Christ's instrumentality, every disposition of his body was subject to his power. However, we may also consider a more speculative interpretation of Aquinas' position, which would exclude any version of impassibility from Christ's earthly life, including one that's miraculous. Given that Christ co-assumed passibility, could he have co-assumed the power to prevent his passible body from being injured? Aquinas would reply that Christ could have assumed this power if he had wanted to. Here we have something Christ could have co-assumed, but did not. It is not that Christ had the power to preserve his body from injury when attacked, but did not use it. Rather, he didn't have the power at all. Aquinas gives no reason why this power would not have been assumed, but it's easy to see why he thought it was not. It was the purpose of the Incarnation that Christ redeem us by his passion. The power to prevent injury miraculously would in no way contribute to that goal. Moreover, were Christ to have exercised such power prior to the Passion, it would have led to the impression that he was not really human. This is perhaps confirmed by what Aquinas said about the assumption of power to change material creatures. If we speak of Christ's soul, the instrument of the Word united to him, it had an instrumental power to effect all the miraculous changes ordainable to the end of the Incarnation, which is to re-establish all things that are in heaven and on earth. By citing Ephesians 1:10, Aquinas was alluding to the miraculous transformation of all things at the end of time, which he clearly thinks will be effected instrumentally through the instrument of Christ's humanity. The miracles of Christ's earthly life are ordained in the service of our faith in the Incarnation. On Aquinas' view, then, Christ co-assumed the power to perform not just those miracles that were ordained to the Incarnation, but whatever miracles were ordainable to the end of the Incarnation, even if he did not in fact do them. Aquinas was inclined to think an incarnate divine person would assume perfection rather than defect. However, the perfection or defect was assumed to serve our salvation. Only those miracles which could not serve Christ's saving mission were excluded from assumption. I end the paper by asking whether this approach can help us with other speculative matter, including why Adam, other Old Testament figures, and the Christian martyrs seem to enjoy gifts the earthly Christ did not possess. I also explore whether this approach can explain why, in Mark's Gospel, Christ did not work miracles where there was a lack of faith. Finally, I suggest that an appreciation of Christ's power to work miracles can reinforce our appreciation that Christ's grace and knowledge were freely assumed.
Minutes for questions.
Thanks, Father Gaine. You outlined the change in reasoning Thomas employs in considering what sort of power Christ assumed. Previously, he considered it as a kind of consequence of the union. Then he considered it as insofar as it pertained to some kind of salvific purpose, right? I'm wondering whether you find reasons for Thomas no longer thinking it should be a consequence of the union, not just a recognition that the reasoning has changed, but why he might disagree with the reasoning he previously employed.
Consequences of the union, it's a broad category. Albert the Great used it too in his sentence commentary in trying to make sense or order what's in Peter Lombard's sentences. So I don't think it was that there was a great thinking about it beforehand, and it's not clear to what extent Aquinas thought this was something that followed necessarily from the Incarnation, or whether it was only some other kind of consequence. But I suppose what he'd been thinking about in the meantime, and I think it was seeing this division among the Franciscans, he came to think that if you think very clearly about what an incarnation must involve, and God could have caused incarnations in different circumstances, he could see an incarnation need not involve all the things that the actual incarnation involved. It was really because it was much more focused on God's saving purpose. And I think at the same time, in ordering the Summa, the saving purpose of the Incarnation was coming very much to the fore of his thinking. So I think all those things fitted together. I have the feeling that if he thought about it more, he might not have done it as he did. There are questions that don't get asked, talking about instrumentality as such. Would that be under assumption or a consequence of the union? I think it would be a consequence. That doesn't mean everything about it would follow. He was an instrument. I think that's what he thought. He doesn't give us a question on it. There are these things that he doesn't say, and nor does he explain his thinking. So to some extent, I've been trying to reconstruct, thinking about what was going on in St. Thomas's head.
Thank you for the talk. I just had a question about instrumentality. Could you say more? I thought you said that with respect to grace, he was a principal efficient cause, but not instrumental efficient cause?
In terms of certain acts arising from the fact that he had the co-assumption of grace. In terms of him being the cause of grace in us, he would be an instrumental cause. There would be other ways, Aquinas thinks, in which Christ, having been graced, can be the principal cause of certain acts, like enlightening us about matters of revelation and so on. But that doesn't mean that everything in regard to grace is going to be principal.
One thing that struck me was that Christ was limited in his ability to do a miracle by a human's lack
of faith or not developed faith. And one thing that I hadn't understood before this conference was that Aquinas said Jesus did not have. So, how could he have been limited in his ability to do something by the lack of somebody else's faith?
Aquinas thinks he wasn't limited. In his commentary on Matthew's Gospel, there's no sense he was limited. He has the divine power to do this. When he talks about, I mentioned the Gospel of Mark, he does mention this in the Summa Theologiae when discussing whether miracles were by divine power, and he affirms divine power there. So I think that Aquinas thinks he just didn't do it. There was a good reason not to do it, and so he didn't do it. Although there are some exceptions in both Matthew and Mark, because he didn't want the people to have the excuse that we would have believed if you'd worked some miracles. So he does work a couple, and then the people have no excuse. He takes it from Theophylact. He's got sources for all these things. So I think it was my suggestion, it's only a speculation, maybe you could use the notions that has about co-assumption of power. You could use that to say maybe because it was not fitting for his mission that he work miracles where people were ill-disposed to have faith, maybe he did not assume the power to work them. And you can use that as another way to explain the inability that we see in Mark's Gospel. But it's not something that Aquinas actually says. I was suggesting we might be able to get speculative exegesis that gives another way to interpret Mark's. He could not work miracles there. Yeah.
We can open questions to the panels. Direct your question wherever you like.
This is for Val. I think I didn't catch what you said in the part of the paper where Aquinas is insisting upon Christ's freedom on the cross, his freedom to die or to choose to die. And he talks about something that's always, at least when I first read it, quite alarmed me. I thought he talked about his power to repel the nails or not be crucified. And I thought I thought you were saying Aquinas hold that Christ, his human soul, did not have that power. I had this memory of thinking that the human soul in some way did have that power, but I know I missed something in Aquinas.
First of all, on those texts, it would be good to check whether he's speaking about divine power or about human power. The simplest way to interpret Aquinas in the co-assumption of power question would be to say that he did have that power in his human soul. In Article 3 of question 13, in the body of the article, by his instrumentality, the whole disposition, every disposition of Christ's body was subject to his power. So that would lead me to think that Aquinas did think he had the power in his human soul. It's just that in the reply to one of the objections, when he talks about Adam having the power to prevent injury to his body when attacked, he does say that Christ could have taken on that power if he'd wanted to. Now, there does seem to be a tension between what you've got in the response, the text you're quoting, and what he says in the reply to the objection. I think there is a simple way to resolve it as a historical interpretation of Aquinas, to say he's only excluding Adam's version of impact, but not excluding every version. Another way to come at it, a more speculative rather than purely historical interpretation, where maybe Christ did not assume the power to prevent that injury at all in his human soul, on account of the fact that it could not be ordained to the end of the incarnation, was for him to suffer and die on our behalf. That's an alternative speculative reading, which Aquinas does not clearly say. But I would like to give it a run for its money. A lot of what Aquinas has in this question is undeveloped. You feel he's in a bit of a hurry. He makes things less clear than he usually does. This gives us the opportunity to play with different alternatives for how this might be developed. He doesn't give a reason why he thinks Christ's instrumentality would give him complete power over the dispositions of his body. I suspect it's because he thinks that this would pertain to Christ's perfection. There's an awful lot of talk about ordering things to the plan of salvation. Joshua shows in his article in the International Journal of Systematic Theology that you've got two principles at work, and maybe they are actually ordered to one another, and the principle of perfection is ordered to the soteriological principle. Have I got you right? Okay. Has Aquinas thought through all the ways the principle of perfection is subordinated to the soteriological principle? Christ might not have assumed complete power over every aspect of his humanity, because it might not have served the end of the incarnation well. This is speculation rather than historical exegesis of what Aquinas actually said or thought.
Just make one comment. I agree with you. That makes a lot of sense. I really like this because I remember when I was a student, when I first read this, it freaked me out. The idea that the nails could bounce off human flesh just seemed implausible to me. It seemed not Gnostic. But let me ask you for one follow-up. One thing that really does strike me was that, let's just say that on the Wednesday before Holy Thursday, if Christ had gotten a terrible cold and couldn't get out of bed. Do you understand the question I'm raising? In other words, I'm extremely comfortable with
Christ
not
having a
close-
cold.
I'm extremely comfortable with Christ not assuming the power to prevent the nails. It does seem important. Maybe you would have just appealed to divine providence. You wouldn't want Christ to be so susceptible that if someone had given him the flu that week, the salvation of the world would somehow have been delayed or something.
Yeah, God's providence can sort that, make sure it doesn't happen. Aquinas thought Christ had the instrumental power to heal his flu. He would
But
have
that would be
thought
the
that.
same principle, right? The same principle as for
Well, it
pulling
depends. He
nails.
might have thought it would contribute to the end of the incarnation if Christ could heal himself of the flu, so he could go and do what he's got to do on Thursday and Friday.
Okay, let me make sure I'm clear. So you're saying we can take away the power for repelling the nails.
For what can't be ordained to the end of the incarnation.
I see. I understand.
I wouldn't exclude what could be ordained to the end of the incarnation. Maybe being able to heal his flu miraculously that he catches on Wednesday could be ordainable to the end of the incarnation.
What if we don't use the flu example? What if he's going to get hit by a camel and die of accidental causes right before his passing? The question is, it seems that being able to have an impassible body or make his body impassible would order his life towards the purpose of the incarnation, like allowing him to survive the encounter with the camel. So what's the point? It seems like it's not the case that having that power couldn't be ordered towards the purpose of the incarnation. Does that make sense? Like,
So you mean it could be ordered in the case of being hit by the camel, which
Yeah.
could be a mortal injury? Yeah. Okay, he could prevent himself from injury, except the ultimate point is for him to be injured. And it would be quite possible for divine providence to prevent Christ from being hit by the camel. Also, he might have such good. And Aquinas thinks Christ has a body formed by the Holy Spirit, so he's pretty agile and everything. His senses work well. He probably could have dodged the camel.
But if the claim is he doesn't assume the powers that could not, yet it is impossible for them to be
Yeah.
ordered towards the good of the incarnation, then
Yeah.
it seems like the impassibility power is disqualified.
You've got a great point. I have to think about it more, but that's an excellent point.
Thank you all for your very clear presentations. This has been fantastic. I did want to ask Fritz one more question about the presentation. In the first question of the Summa, Thomas says the theologian knows what the philosopher knows, but under a different ratio. It's analogous to the way an astronomer and a mathematician might have similar knowledge about the same material object under a different formal aspect. To understand the burden of your paper is the difference between Christ's infused and acquired knowledge substantially different from the distinction I'm drawing now to make the coexistence inscrutable?
You should really be asking Father because he's thought a lot about this. It seems that's exactly the kind of move he tries to make. The trouble I have is it would only be analogous to that distinction, right? We're talking about different kinds of acquired knowledge. That might solve the problem of differently derived species perfecting the same power. But I think the thing that really makes me stumble is the sheer implausibility of the idea of Christ having active knowledge of all things humanly knowable. Not in a kind of non-discursive way, as you would in the beatific vision, but discursive knowledge. Christ knew whether the Orioles are going to get the wild card to be in the postseason. He knew that. He won't tell me when I pray to him. There's something about the sheer implausibility of it. Whereas I can imagine how two different people could know the same material object under different rods, how the same person could know the same material object in an infused and an acquired manner. It's hard for me to imagine the part where it makes me stumble. But that's a very modern question. That's not the question Aquinas is asking. He's asking about the perfection of Christ's powers, right? Doesn't he ask this question? It seems to me a very natural question to ask. When Christ has infused knowledge of Aramaic, what's going on when he's getting acquired knowledge of Aramaic by watching Mary and Joseph speaking at home? How does his infused knowledge of physics affect his learning to walk at age 1? It's hard for me to imagine Thomas didn't ask. Maybe he doesn't for a particular purpose. Maybe there's a reason he doesn't think these are questions worth asking.